and someone came up with the bright idea of what's called a skylight and seclusion aviary. All four walls were opaque, and just the roof was open, so there was no disturbance for the birds. But what we found was that we'd overdone it. The offspring that were born in those environments were basket cases, because they hadn't got the sensory input that they needed. We've got it completely the wrong way round. I mean, animals may not be intelligent, but they're not as stupid as a lot of human beings. You look at the primate areas in some zoos, which are equipped with metal, green, architect-designed trees, which in a minimalist sort of way reproduce the shape of the tree, but don't actually include any of the features that a monkey might find interesting about a tree, leaves and bark and stuff. It may look like a tree to an architect, but architects are a lot more stupid than monkeys. We just got a brochure through from the States for exactly this, fiberglass trees. The whole brochure was designed to show us how proud they were of what they could sell us here in Mauritius, and showing the particular paints they had for painting lichen on trees. I mean, it's bloody ridiculous. Who are these people? Okay, let's feed the bird. You watching? The bird was watching. It's hard to avoid saying that it was watching like a hawk. It was watching like a kestrel. Richard swung his arm back. The kestrel's head followed his movement precisely. With a wide underarm swing, Richard lobbed the small mouse high up into the air. For a second or so, the kestrel just watched it, chittering its legs very slightly on the branch as it engaged in monumental feats of differential calculus. The mouse reached the top of its steep parabola, its tiny dead weight turning slowly in the air. At last the kestrel dropped from its perch and swung out into the air as if on the end of a long pendulum, the precise length, pivotal position and swing speed of which the kestrel had calculated. The arc it described intersected sweetly with that of the falling mouse. The kestrel took the mouse cleanly into its talons, swept up into another nearby tree, and bit its head off. "He eats the head himself," said Richard, "and takes the rest of the mouse to the female in the nest." We fed the kestrel a few more mice, sometimes throwing them in the air, and sometimes leaving them on the hemispherical rock for it to dive for at its leisure. At last the bird was fed up, and we left. The term fed up actually comes from falconry. Most of the vocabulary of falconry comes from Middle English, and zoologists have adopted a lot of it. For instance, feeking describes the process by which the bird cleans its beak of meat after eating, by rubbing it along a branch. Newts are the white trails along cliffs where the bird has been sitting. These are normally called bird droppings, of course, but in falconry talk they are newts. Rousing is the action of shaking its wings and body, which is generally a sign that the bird is feeling very comfortable and relaxed. When you train a falcon, you train it by hunger, using it as a tool to manipulate the bird's psychology. So when the bird has had too much to eat, it won't cooperate, and gets annoyed by any attempts to tell it what to do. It simply sits in the top of a tree and sulks. It is fed up. Richard became extremely fed up that evening, and with reason. It was nothing to do with eating too much, though it had a little to do with what other people like to eat. A Mauritian friend came round to see him, and brought her boss with her, a Frenchman from the nearby island of Réunion, who was visiting the island for a few days and staying with her. His name was Jacques, and we all took an instant dislike to him, but none so strongly as Richard, who detested him on sight. He was a Frenchman of the dapper, arrogant kind. He had lazy, supercilious eyes, a lazy, supercilious smile, and, as Richard later put it, a lazy, supercilious, and terminally stupid brain. Jacques arrived at the house and stood around looking lazy and supercilious. He clearly did not know what he was doing in this house. It was not a very elegant house. It was full of battered second-hand furniture, and had pictures of birds stuck all over the walls with drawing pins. He obviously wanted to slouch moodily against a wall, but could not find a wall that he was prepared to put his shoulder to, so he had to slouch moodily where he was standing. We offered him a beer, and he took one with the best grace he could muster. He asked us what we were doing here, and we said we were making a programme for the BBC and writing a book about the wildlife of Mauritius. "But why?" he said in a puzzled tone. "There is nothing here." Richard showed admirable restraint at first. He explained quite coolly that some of the rarest birds in the world were to be found on Mauritius. He explained that that was what he and Carl and the others were there for, to protect and study and breed them. Jacques shrugged and said they weren't particularly interesting or special. "Oh," said Richard quietly. "Nothing with any interesting plumage?" "Really?" said Richard. "I prefer something like the Arabian cockatoo," said Jacques, with a lazy smile. "Do you?" "Me, I live on Réunion," said Jacques. "Do you?" "There are certainly no interesting birds there," said Jack. "That's because the French have shot them all," said Richard. He turned round smartly and went off into the kitchen to wash up very, very loudly. Only when Jacques had gone did he return. He stalked back into the room carrying an unopened bottle of rum and slammed himself into the corner of a battered old sofa. "About 5 years ago," he said, "we took 20 of the pink pigeons that we had bred at the centre and released them into the wild. I would estimate that in terms of the time, work and resources we had put into them, they had cost us about £1,000 per bird. But that's not the issue. The issue is holding on to the unique life of this island. But within a short time, all of those birds we had bred were in casseroles. Couldn't believe it. We just couldn't believe it. Do you understand what's happening to this island? It's a mess. It's a complete ruin. In the 50s, it was drenched with DDT, which found its way straight into the food chain. That killed off a lot of animals. Then the island was hit with cyclones. Well, we can't help that. But they hit an island that was already terribly weakened by all the DDT and logging, so they did irreparable damage. Now, with the continued logging and burning of the forest, there's only 10% left, and they're cutting that down for deer hunting. What's left of the unique species of Mauritius is being overrun by stuff that you can find all over the world. Privet, guava, all this crap. Here, look at this." He handed the bottle to us. It was a locally brewed rum called Green Island. Read what it says on the bottle. Underneath a romantic picture of an old sailing ship approaching an idyllic tropical island was a quotation from Mark Twain which read, "You gather the idea that Mauritius was made first and then heaven, and that heaven was copied after Mauritius." "That was less than 100 years ago," said Richard. "Since then, just about everything that shouldn't be done to an island has been done to Mauritius, except perhaps nuclear testing." There is one island in the Indian Ocean, close to Mauritius, which is miraculously unspoilt, and that is Round Island. In fact, it isn't a miracle at all. There's a very simple reason for it, which we discovered when we talked to Carl and Richard about going there. "You can't," said Carl. "Well, you can try, but I doubt you'd manage it." "Why not?" I asked. "Waves, you know, the sea," said Carl. "Goes like this." He made big heaving motions with his arms. "It's extremely difficult to get on," said Richard. "It has no beaches or harbours. You can only go there on very calm days, and even then you have to jump from the boat to the island. It's quite dangerous. You've got to judge it exactly right, or you get thrown against the rocks. We haven't lost anybody yet, but they almost lost me." We hitched a ride on a boat trip with some naturalists going to Round Island, anchored about 100 yards from the rocky coastline, and ferried ourselves across in a dinghy to the best thing that Round Island has to offer by way of a landing spot, a slippery outcrop called Pigeon House Rock. A couple of men in wetsuits first leapt out of the dinghy into the tossing sea, swam to the rock, climbed with difficulty up the side of it, and at last slithered, panting, onto the top. Everyone else, in turn, then made the trip across in the dinghy, 3 or 4 at a time. To land, you had to make the tricky jump across onto the rock, matching the crest of the incoming waves to the top of the rock, and leaping just an instant before the wave reached its height, so that the boat was still bearing you upwards. Those already on the rock would be tugging at the dinghy's rope, shouting instructions and encouragement over the crashing of the waves, then catching and hauling people as they jumped. I was the last one to land. By this time the sea swell was getting heavier and rougher, and it was suggested that I should try landing on the other side of the rock, where it was a lot steeper, but a little less obviously slippery with algae. I tried it. I leapt from the edge of the heaving boat, lunged for the rock, found it to be every bit as slippery as the other side, merely much steeper, and slithered gracelessly down it into the sea, grazing my legs and arms against the jagged edges. The sea closed over my head. I thrashed about under the surface, trying desperately to get my head up, but the dinghy was directly above me and kept bashing me against the rock face whenever I tried to make for the surface. "Okay," I thought, "I've got the point. This is why the island is relatively unspoilt." I made one more lunge upwards, just as those on the shore succeeded at last in pushing the boat away from me. This allowed me to get my head up above the water and cling onto a crack in the rock. With a lot more slipping and sliding and thrashing in the heavy swell, I managed finally to manoeuvre myself up to within arm's reach of Mark and the others, who yanked me urgently up and onto the rock. I sat in a spluttering, bleeding heap, protesting that I was fine, and all I needed was a quiet corner to go and die in, and everything would be all right. The sea had been swelling heavily for the 2 or 3 hours it had taken us to reach the island, and it seemed as if my stomach had heaved something approaching my entire body weight into the sea. So by this time I was feeling pretty wobbly and strung out, and my day on Round Island passed in rather a blur. While Mark went with Wendy Strahm, the botanist, to try and find some of the species of plants and animals that exist only here, on this single island, I went and sat in the sun near a palm tree called Beverley, and felt dazed and sorry for myself. I knew that the palm tree was called Beverley because Wendy told me that was what she had christened it. It was a bottle palm, so called because it is shaped like a Chianti bottle, and it was one of the 8 that remain on Round Island, the only 8 wild ones in the world. Who on earth, I wondered as I sat next to Beverley in a sort of companionable gloom, gets to name the actual islands? I mean, here was one of the most amazing islands in the world. It looked utterly extraordinary, as if the moon itself was rising from the sea, except that where the moon would be cold and still, this was hot and darting with life. Though it appeared to be dusty and barren at first sight, the craters with which the surface was pocked were full of dazzling white-tailed tropic birds, brilliant Telfair's skinks, and Gunther's geckos. You would think that if you had to come up with a name for an island like this, you'd invite a couple of friends round, get some wine, and make an evening of it. Not just say, oh, it's a little bit round, let's call it Round Island. Apart from anything else, it isn't even particularly round. There was another island just visible on the horizon, which is much more nearly round, but that is called Serpent Island, presumably to honour the fact that, unlike Round Island, it hasn't got any snakes on it. And there was another island I could see, which sloped steadily from a peak at one end down to the sea at the other, and that, unaccountably, was called Flat Island. I began to see that whoever had named the islands probably had made a bit of an evening of it, after all. The reason that Round Island has remained a refuge for unique species of skinks, geckos, boas, palm trees, and even grasses that died out long ago on Mauritius, is not simply that it's hard for man to get onto the island, but that it has proved completely impossible for rats to get ashore. Round Island is one of the largest tropical islands in the world, at a bit over 300 acres, on which rats do not occur. Not that Round Island is undamaged, far from it. 150 years ago, before sailors introduced goats and rabbits onto the island, it was covered in hardwood forest, which the foreign animals destroyed. That is why, from a distance, and to the untutored eye, such as mine, the island appeared to be more or less barren at first sight. Only a naturalist would be able to tell you that the few odd-shaped palms and clumps of grass dotted about the place on the hot, dry, dusty land were unique and unspeakably precious. Precious to whom and why? Does it actually matter very much to anyone other than a bunch of obsessed naturalists that the 8 bottle palm trees on Round Island are the only ones to be found in the wild anywhere in the world? Or that the Hyophorbe americalis, a palm tree so rare that it doesn't have any name other than its scientific one, standing in the Curepeat Botanic Gardens in Mauritius, is the only one of its kind in existence. The tree was only discovered by chance while the ground on which it stands was being cleared in order to construct the Botanic Gardens. It was about to be cut down. There is no tropical island paradise I know of which remotely matches up to the fantasy ideal that such a phrase is meant to conjure up, or even to what we find described in holiday brochures. It's natural to put this down to the discrepancy we're all used to finding between what the advertisers promise and what the real world delivers. It doesn't surprise us much anymore. So it can come as a shock to realize that the world we hear described by travellers of previous centuries, or even previous decades, and biologists of today really did exist. The state it's in now is only the result of what we've done to it, and the mildness of the disappointment we feel when we arrive somewhere and find that it's a bit tatty is only a measure of how far our own expectations have been degraded and how little we understand what we've lost. The people who do understand what we've lost are the ones who are rushing around in a frenzy trying to save the bits that are left. The system of life on this planet is so astoundingly complex that it was a long time before man even realized that it was a system at all, and that it wasn't something that was just there. To understand how anything very complex works, or even to know that there is something complex at work, man needs to see little tiny bits of it at a time. And this is why small islands have been so important to our understanding of life. On the Galapagos Islands, for instance, animals and plants which shared the same ancestors began to change and adapt in different ways once they were divided from each other by a few miles of water. The islands neatly separated out the component parts of the process for us, and it was thus that Charles Darwin was able to make the observations which led directly to the idea of evolution. The island of Mauritius gave us an equally important but more sombre idea: extinction. The most famous of all the animals on Mauritius is a large, gentle dove. A remarkably large dove, in fact. Its weight is closer to that of a large turkey. Its wings long ago gave up the idea of lifting such a plumpy off the ground, and withered away into decorative little stumps. Once it gave up flying, it could adapt itself very well to the Mauritian seasonal cycle, and stuff itself silly in the late summer and autumn, when fruit is lying rich on the ground, and then live on its fat reserves, gradually losing weight during the leaner, dry months. It didn't need to fly anyway, since there were no predators that wished it any harm, and it, in turn, is harmless itself. In fact, the whole idea of harm is something that it has never learnt to understand, so if you were to see one on the beach, it would be quite likely to walk right up to you and take a look, provided it could find a path through the armies of giant tortoises parading around the beach. There's never even been any reason for humans to kill it, because its meat is tough and bitter. It has a large, wide, downturned bill of yellow and green, which gives it a slightly glum and melancholic look, small, round eyes like diamonds, and 3 ridiculously little plumes sticking out of its tail. One of the first Englishmen to see this large dove said that for shape and rareness it might antagonize the phoenix of Arabia. None of us will ever see this bird, though, because, sadly, the last one was clubbed to death by Dutch colonists in about 1680. The giant tortoises were eaten to extinction because the early sailors regarded them much as we regard canned food. They just picked them off the beach and put them on their ships as ballast, and then, if they felt hungry, they'd go down to the hold, pull one up, kill it, and eat it. But the large, gentle dove, the dodo, was just clubbed to death for the sport of it. And that is what Mauritius is most famous for, the extinction of the dodo. There have been extinctions before, but this was a particularly remarkable animal, and it only lived in the naturally limited area of the island of Mauritius. There were, very clearly and obviously, no more of them, and since only dodos could make a new dodo, there never would be any more of them ever again. The facts are very clearly and starkly delineated for us by the boundaries of the island. Up until that point, it hadn't really clicked with man that an animal could just cease to exist. It was as if we hadn't realized that if we kill something, it simply won't be there anymore. Ever. As a result of the extinction of the dodo, we are sadder and wiser. We finally made it to Rodrigues, a small island dependency of Mauritius, to look for the world's rarest fruit bat. But first of all, we went to look at something that Wendy Strahm was very keen for us to see, so much so that she rearranged her regular Rodrigues visiting schedule to take us there herself. By the side of a hot and dusty road, there was a single small bushy tree that looked as if it had been put in a concentration camp. The plant was a kind of wild coffee called Ramus mania, and it had been believed to be totally extinct. Then, in 1981, a teacher from Mauritius called Raymond Acquis was teaching at a school in Rodrigues and gave his class pictures of about 10 plants that were thought to be extinct on Mauritius. One of the children put his hand up and said, "Please, sir, we've got this growing in our back garden." At first it was hard to believe, but they took a branch of it and sent it to Kew, where it was identified. It was wild coffee. The plant was standing by the side of the road, right by the traffic, and in considerable danger because any plant in Rodrigues is considered fair game for firewood. So they put a fence round it to stop it being cut down. Immediately they did this, however, people started thinking, aha, this is a special plant, and they climbed over the fence and started to take off little branches and leaves and pieces of bark. Because the tree was obviously special, everybody wanted a piece of it, and started to ascribe remarkable properties to it. It would cure hangovers and gonorrhea. Since not much goes on in Rodrigues other than home entertainments, it quickly became a very sought-after plant, and it was rapidly being killed by having bits cut off it. The first fence was soon rendered useless, and a barbed wire fence was put around that. Then another barbed wire fence had to be put around the first barbed wire fence, and then a third barbed wire fence had to be put around the second, until the whole compound covered half an acre. Then a guard was installed to watch the plant as well. With cuttings from this one plant, Kew Gardens are currently trying to root and cultivate 2 new plants, in the hope that it might then be possible to reintroduce them into the wild. Until they succeed, this single plant standing within its barbed wire barricades will be the only representative of its species on Earth, and it will continue to need protecting from everyone who is prepared to kill it in order to have a small piece. It's easy to think that as a result of the extinction of the dodo, we are now sadder and wiser, but there's a lot of evidence to suggest that we are merely sadder and better informed. At dusk that day we stood by the side of another road, where we had been told we would have a good view, and watched as the world's rarest fruit bats left their roosts in the forest and flapped across the darkening sky to make their nightly forage among the fruit trees. The bats are doing just fine. There are hundreds of them. I have a terrible feeling that we are in trouble. Sifting through the embers. There's a story I heard when I was young, which bothered me because I couldn't understand it. It was many years before I discovered it to be the story of the Sibylline books. By that time, all the details of the story had rewritten themselves in my mind, but the essentials were still the same. After a year of exploring some of the endangered environments of the world, I think I finally understand it. It concerns an ancient city. It doesn't matter where it was or what it was called. It was a thriving, prosperous city set in the middle of a large plain. One summer, while the people of the city were busy thriving and prospering away, a strange old beggar woman arrived at the gates carrying 12 large books, which she offered to sell to them. She said that the books contained all the knowledge and all the wisdom of the world, and that she would let the city have all 12 of them in return for a single sack of gold. The people of the city thought this was a very funny idea. They said she obviously had no conception of the value of gold, and that probably the best thing was for her to go away again. This she agreed to do, but first she said she was going to destroy half of the books in front of them. She built a small bonfire, burnt 6 of the books of all knowledge and all wisdom in the sight of the people of the city, and then went on her way. Winter came and went, a hard winter, but the city just about managed to flourish through it, and then the following summer the old woman was back. "Oh, you again," said the people of the city. "How's the knowledge and wisdom going?" 6 books, she said, "just 6 left, half of all the knowledge and wisdom in the world. Once again, I am offering to sell them to you." "Oh, yes," sniggered the people of the city. "Only the price has changed." Not surprised. 2 sacks of gold. What? 2 sacks of gold for the 6 remaining books of knowledge and wisdom. Take it or leave it. "It seems to us," said the people of the city, "that you can't be very wise or knowledgeable yourself, or you realise that you can't just go around quadrupling an already outrageous price in a buyer's market. That's the sort of knowledge and wisdom you're peddling. Then, frankly, you can keep it at any price." "Do you want them or not?" "No." "Very well. I will trouble you for a little firewood." She built another bonfire, and burnt 3 of the remaining books in front of them, and then set off back across the plain. That night, one or two curious people from the city sneaked out and sifted through the embers to see if they could salvage the odd page or two, but the fire had burnt very thoroughly, and the old woman had raked the ashes. There was nothing. Another hard winter took its toll on the city, and they had a little trouble with famine and disease, but trade was good, and they were in reasonably good shape again by the following summer, when, once again, the old woman appeared. "You're early this year," they said to her. "Less to carry," she explained, showing them the 3 books she was still carrying. "A quarter of all the knowledge and wisdom in the world. Do you want it?" "What's the price?" 4 sacks of gold. "You're completely mad, old woman. Apart from anything else, our economy is going through a bit of a sticky patch at the moment. Sacks of gold are completely out of the question." "Firewood, please." "Now, wait a minute," said the people of the city. "This isn't doing anybody any good. We've been thinking about all this, and we've put together a small committee to have a look at these books of yours. Let us evaluate them for a few months, see if they're worth anything to us, and when you come back next year, perhaps we can put in some kind of a reasonable offer. We are not talking sacks of gold here, though." The old woman shook her head. "No," she said. "Bring me the firewood." "It'll cost you." "No matter," said the old woman with a shrug. "The books will burn quite well by themselves." So saying, she set about shredding 2 of the books into pieces, which then burnt easily. She set off swiftly across the plain, and left the people of the city to face another year. She was back in the late spring. "Just one left," she said, putting it down on the ground in front of her. "So I was able to bring my own firewood." "How much?" said the people of the city. 16 sacks of gold." "We'd only budgeted for 8. "Take it or leave it." "Wait here." The people of the city went off into a huddle, and returned half an hour later. 16 sacks is all we've got left," they pleaded. "Times are hard. You must leave us with something." The old woman just hummed to herself as she started to pile the kindling together. "All right," they cried at last, opened up the gates of the city, and led out 2 ox carts, each laden with 8 sacks of gold. "But it had better be good." "Thank you," said the old woman. "It is, and you should have seen the rest of it." She led the 2 ox carts away across the plain with her, and left the people of the city to survive as best they could with the 1 remaining 12th of all the knowledge and wisdom that had been in the world.
Was this really our last chance to see these animals? Unfortunately, there are too many unknowns for there to be a simple answer. With strenuous efforts in the field, the populations of some have actually begun to rise. But it's clear that if those efforts were suspended for a moment, the kakapos, the Yangtze River dolphins, the northern white rhinos and many others would vanish almost immediately. Not that a large population necessarily guarantees an animal's future survival, as experience has shown many times in the past. The most famous example is the North American passenger pigeon, which was once the commonest bird that ever lived on Earth. Yet it was hunted to extinction in little more than 50 years. We didn't learn any lessons from that experience. 10 years ago there were 1.3 million elephants in Africa, but so many have been killed by poachers that today no more than 600,000 are left. On the other hand, even the smallest populations can be brought back from the brink. Juan Fernandez's fur seal numbers dropped from millions to fewer than 100 by 1965. Today there are 3,000. And in New Zealand in 1978, the population of Chatham Island robins was down to just 1 pregnant female. But the dedication of Don Merton and his team saved the species from extinction, and there are now more than 50. The kakapo may also be on a slow road to recovery. Soon after we returned to England, we received the following letter from New Zealand. P.O. Box 3, Stewart Island. Dear Douglas and Mark, I hope this reaches you quickly. I have some good news from kakapo country on southern Stewart Island. At 08:45 hours on 25th of August 1989, one of our dog handlers, Alan Munn, and his English setter, HÄRRY, located a new female kakapo near Lee's Knob, at an altitude of 380 metres. Jane weighed 1.25 kilograms, and she scraped a lot when Alan picked her up. She'd just finished molting but looked in good condition, so in a few days she'll be flown to her new home, Codfish Island. Once again, thanks very much for your visit. It certainly helped give those big green budgies some of the attention they deserve. Yours sincerely, Andy Roberts, Kakapo Project Manager. We later received some further good news about the kakapos. 2 more females have been found on Stewart Island and transferred to Codfish, bringing the total kakapo population up to 43. Meanwhile, on Little Barrier Island, several of the males there have been booming for the first time, including, to everyone's delight, a 9-year-old called Snark. Born on Stewart Island in 1981, Snark was the only kakapo chick to have been seen by anyone this century. But the best news of all was still to come. Just before going to press, a very excited Don Merton telephoned to say that a newly made kakapo nest has just been found on Little Barrier Island. Inside the nest, which was built by a 9-year-old female called Heather, was a single kakapo egg. Transferring kakapos to Little Barrier and Codfish Islands has been a calculated risk, but it's the only hope of saving the kakapo from extinction. Heather's nest is the first encouraging sign that the project is actually working, and now everyone is waiting nervously to see if her egg will hatch and if she can raise the chick in her adopted home. We also received a letter from Kes Hillman Smith in Zaire to say that 3 baby northern white rhinos have been born in Garamba since we left, bringing the total population up to 25. The enthusiastic park staff have named them Mpiko, meaning courage, Melende, meaning perseverance, and Minzoto, meaning a star. It's important to recognise that not every conservation strategy necessarily works. We're often experimenting in the dark. During the early stages of the Garamba project, a lot of pressure was put on the Zaïwa to have all their northern white rhinos captured and taken into captivity. The government of Zaire would not agree to this. They said that the rhinos belonged to them, and they didn't want them to go to zoos in other parts of the world. Fortunately, it seems that this was the right decision. Northern white rhinos, it turned out, do not breed well in captivity. The last one was born in 1982, whereas more than 10 have been born in the same period in the wild. The news from Mauritius has been more mixed. The kestrels are doing well, and Carl believes that there could now be as many as 100 of them in the wild, including 12 breeding pairs. However, the population of truly wild pink pigeons has dropped to fewer than 10. Some of the pigeons have been bred in captivity and are being released again. So far, they've escaped the hunters and appear to be doing well. As for the echo parakeets, at least one of them has died since we saw them, although some of the others have been attempting to breed. In November 1989, Carl found a parakeet nest with 3 eggs inside. One of these mysteriously disappeared soon afterwards, so he decided to risk removing the others to the captive breeding centre for safe keeping. Both eggs hatched successfully, and the chicks are fit and well. Perhaps most important of all, for non-ornithologists, the wild population of Rodrigues fruit bats has just passed the 1,000 mark. In contrast, after the radio series had been broadcast, we received a disturbing letter from a couple who had been working in China. Dear Douglas and Mark, we enjoyed the Yangtze dolphin programme, but listened with a touch of guilt. We recently spent 3 months working in a number of factories in Nanjing. We had a wonderful time with the people and ate well. To honour us, when we left, one of them cooked a Yangtze dolphin, so really there should be 201. Sorry about that. P.S. Sorry, it was 2 dolphins. My husband reminds me that he was guest of honour and had the embryo. There's probably little hope of saving the dolphins in the Yangtze River itself, despite all the time and effort invested in protecting them. Perhaps in semi-captivity, in the reserve at Tongling and the new one at Shishu, they'll stand a chance, though it could never be the same as being wild and free. Meanwhile, of course, the noise and pollution continue. No one knows how many other species are this close to extinction. We don't even know how many species of animals and plants there are altogether in the world. A staggering 1.4 million have been found and identified so far, but some experts believe that there are another 30 million yet to be discovered. It's not surprising when you consider that we know more about the surface of the moon than we do about parts of our own planet. Many animals and plants are disappearing even before we're aware of their existence, perhaps hidden away somewhere in the depths of an unexplored sea or in a quiet corner of tropical rainforest. And it's not only the tiny, obscure creatures that have managed to escape our attention. There have been some exciting new discoveries in the rainforests of Madagascar, for example, since Douglas and I were there looking for the ii in 1985. Field researchers have found 2 new species of lemur. One, called the golden bamboo lemur, has beautiful golden eyebrows, orange cheeks and a rich reddish-brown coat. The other has a shock of golden orange on the top of its head and has been named the golden-crowned schiffark. Both lemurs are extremely rare and virtually unknown. What roles do they play in Madagascar's rainforests? Do they have any direct relevance to our own lives? What are the main threats to their survival? We don't know. They could become extinct before the experts learn enough to save them. Wildlife conservation is always a race against time. As zoologists and botanists explore new areas, scrabbling to record the mere existence of species before they become extinct, it's like someone hurrying through a burning library, desperately trying to jot down some of the titles of books that will now never be read. Extinctions, of course, have been happening for millions of years. Animals and plants were disappearing long before people arrived on the scene. But what has changed is the extinction rate. For millions of years, on average, one species became extinct every year. But most of the extinctions since prehistoric times have occurred in the last 300 years. And most of the extinctions that have occurred in the last 300 years have occurred in the last 50. And most of the extinctions that have occurred in the last 50 have occurred in the last 10. It's the sheer rate of acceleration that's as terrifying as anything else. We are now heaving more than 1,000 different species of animals and plants off the planet every year. There are currently 5 billion human beings, and their numbers are continually growing. We're fighting for space with the world's wildlife, which has to contend with hunting, pollution, pesticides, and most important of all, the loss of habitat. Rainforests alone contain half the world's species of animals and plants, yet an area the size of Austria is being destroyed every year. There are so many threatened animals around the world that at the rate of 1 every 3 weeks, it would have taken Douglas and me more than 300 years to search for them all. And if we decided to include threatened plants as well, it would have taken another 1,000 years. In every remote corner there are people like Carl Jones and Don Merton who have devoted their lives to saving them. Very often their determination is all that stands between an endangered species and extinction. But why do they bother? Does it really matter if the Yangtze river dolphin or the kakapo or the northern white rhino or any other species live on only in scientists' notebooks? Well, yes it does. Every animal and plant is an integral part of its environment. Even Komodo dragons have a major role to play in maintaining the ecological stability of their delicate island homes. If they disappear, so could many other species. And conservation is very much in tune with our own survival. Animals and plants provide us with life-saving drugs and food. They pollinate crops and provide important ingredients for many industrial processes. Ironically, it's often not the big and beautiful creatures, but the ugly and less dramatic ones which we need most. Even so, the loss of a few species may seem almost irrelevant compared to major environmental problems such as global warming or the destruction of the ozone layer. But while nature has considerable resilience, there's a limit to how far that resilience can be stretched. No one knows how close to the limit we're getting. The darker it gets, the faster we're driving. There's one last reason for caring, and I believe that no other is necessary. It's certainly the reason why so many people have devoted their lives to protecting the likes of rhinos, parakeets, kakapos and dolphins. And it's simply this: the world would be a poorer, darker, lonelier place without them.